Let's get one thing straight before we dive into the sanctum sanctorum of 1970s musical ambition. If you've come here looking for a hagiography of Bill Bruford, the smiling, technically brilliant drummer of progressive rock's Mount Rushmore, you are in for a rude awakening. Forget the posters on your teenage bedroom wall. Forget the deification of the virtuoso. And forget the cozy narrative that these musicians were all brothers in arms on a holy quest for sonic enlightenment. That story is a fiction, a convenient piece of marketing mythology sold to you alongside the gatefold sleeves and the tour programs. The truth, as is so often the case, is far more jagged, far more interesting, and infinitely more human. To understand what Bill Bruford truly thought of progressive rock, you must first understand that he was, from the very beginning, its most articulate and ruthless internal critic. He wasn't just a player in the game. He was the ghost in the machine, the agent provocateur who saw the genre's magnificent glittering promise and almost immediately recognized the seeds of its own self-important, bloated demise. To grasp Bruford's profoundly ambivalent relationship with the music that made him famous, you have to start not with a drum kit, but with a philosophy. Bruford was, and remains, an intellectual. This is not a man who found his calling by simply wanting to hit things loudly. His approach was analytical, born from a deep love of jazz, a genre predicated on spontaneity, conversation, and the thrill of the unknown. For a young Bill Bruford, the drum kit was a conversational tool, a way to engage in a dynamic, real-time dialogue with other musicians. The goal was discovery, not perfection. The thrill was in the improvisation, the tightrope walk without a net, the collective creation of something that had never existed moments before and would never exist in quite the same way again. He came to rock and roll almost by accident, drawn to its energy and its potential, but he brought his jazzman soul with him, and that soul would spend the next decade at war with the very music he was helping to invent. His tenure in the first classic lineup of Yes is the foundational text for this conflict. On the surface, it was a marriage made in heaven. Here was a band of astonishingly gifted musicians, each pushing the boundaries of their instrument. They shared a common goal, to elevate rock from its three-chord primal scream into a sophisticated art form, imbued with the structural complexity of classical music and the instrumental prowess of jazz. And for a while it was electrifying. Listen to the Yes album or Fragile. You can hear the sparks flying. You can hear the sound of 5 young men inventing a new language in real time. There's a palpable sense of excitement, of charting new territory. Bruford's drumming on tracks like Heart of the Sunrise is a masterclass in propulsive, intelligent percussion. It's busy, yes, but it's always listening, always reacting. It's a conversation. But then, the rot began to set in, the very thing that made Yes great. Their meticulous architectural approach to composition became Bruford's personal prison. The music, largely conceived by John Anderson and Steve Howe, was becoming less of a framework for exploration and more of a sacred text, a fully notated score from which no deviation was permitted. The long, multi-part suites were assembled piece by painstaking piece in the studio, overdub by overdub. The spontaneity was being systematically engineered out of the process. For Bruford, this was anathema. He found himself in the bizarre position of being a world-famous rock drummer who was increasingly being told exactly what to play, down to the last 16th note. The live performances, rather than being an opportunity for expansion and reinterpretation, became exercises in faithful reproduction. He famously described the feeling as being like a curator in a museum, tasked with ensuring a priceless artifact was presented perfectly, identically, night after night after night. The dialogue he craved had been replaced by a monologue. The adventure had become a job. The breaking point, ironically, was the album that many considered to be the absolute zenith of progressive rock, Close to the Edge. It is, by any measure, a staggering piece of work, a dense, beautiful, and immaculately constructed cathedral of sound. And Bruford hated the process of making it. He referred to the sessions as interminable, a torturous process of cutting and pasting tape, of John Anderson asking for the music to sound like the color of a clear summer sky, and of a collective obsession with a platonic ideal of perfection that suffocated any chance of organic musical interaction. He respected the final product as a compositional achievement, but for him as a performer, it was a dead end. It was a beautiful, static monument. Once it was built, his only role was to stand back and admire it, or worse, to polish it for tourists every evening at 8 p.m. sharp. He had helped create the genre's defining masterpiece, and in doing so, he realized he had to escape before it suffocated him completely. He wanted to be a chef in a chaotic, creative kitchen, not a waiter serving the same perfect dish ad nauseum. And so, he made a decision that sent shockwaves through the music world, a move that his bandmates and business managers saw as an act of career suicide. He quit the biggest progressive rock band on the planet, on the eve of a massive sell-out American tour, to join the one group that represented the genre's dark, chaotic, and dangerous shadow, King Crimson. This was not a lateral move. This was a defection, a leap from the pristine white towers of Yes's utopian city into the volatile volcanic landscape ruled by the austere and formidable Robert Fripp. If Yes was about building perfect structures, King Crimson was about controlled demolition. Fripp, the band's intellectual and spiritual guide, had a fundamentally different philosophy. He believed that music was a living, breathing entity, something to be channeled and discovered in the heat of the moment, not something to be meticulously planned and executed. He sought out musicians who were willing to operate at the very edge of their abilities, to risk catastrophic failure on stage every single night for the chance of touching something transcendent. For Fripp, a mistake wasn't a flaw, it was an opportunity, a new door opening. This was everything BRUFORD had been yearning for. He traded the safety and riches of Yes for a massive pay cut and the terrifying prospect of complete musical freedom. The band BRUFORD joined, the Lark's Tongues and Aspic lineup with Fripp, John Wetton, David Cross, and the mad percussionist Jamie Muir, was less a rock group and more a high-risk improvisational unit. Muir would be throwing chains on his cymbals, Fripp would be unleashing guitar textures from another dimension, and BRUFORD found himself in a drummer's paradise. He was finally free to listen, to react, to provoke, to engage in that high-stakes conversation. He famously described this version of King Crimson as a fast-moving, dangerous animal, and you can hear it on the records. The music is jagged, dissonant, and often brutal, but it is undeniably alive. It feels like it could fall apart at any second, and that's precisely where its power comes from. This, for BRUFORD, was the true promise of progressive music. It wasn't about epic song lengths or classical pastiche. It was about pushing the process of making music forward. It was about risk. It was about the glorious, terrifying, unpredictable now. Of course, such an intense and volatile chemistry could not last. King Crimson burned brightly and then imploded in 1974, leaving BRUFORD once again adrift. His subsequent career moves further illuminate his complex views. He did a brief, and by his own admission, mercenary, stint as a touring drummer for Genesis after Phil Collins stepped out from behind the kit. He respected the musicianship. He always held Collins in high regard as a drummer, but he found the music itself to be a different flavor of the same theatricality and rigidity he had fled in Yes. It was professional, it was polished, but it lacked the danger he now craved. It was a job, and he was a consummate professional, but his heart wasn't in it. Then came the Supergroup UK, alongside his Crimson bandmate John Wetton, keyboard wizard Eddie Jobson, and guitar virtuoso Alan Holdsworth. On paper, it was a prog fan's dream. In reality, it was a regression. The band quickly became a vehicle for breathtaking but often sterile displays of virtuosity. The focus shifted back to complex pre-written compositions, leaving little room for the improvisational fire BRUFORD prized. The arguments between the jazz-leaning BRUFORD and Holdsworth and the more rock-oriented Wetton and Jobson were legendary. The project collapsed under the weight of its own talent and its contradictory musical philosophies, reinforcing BRUFORD's growing suspicion that the very term progressive rock had become an oxymoron. The genre had ceased to progress. It had become a style, a set of established conventions, a formula. And then, just as prog rock was collapsing under the weight of its own capes and dry ice machines, along came punk. Most of BRUFORD's peers reacted with predictable horror and disdain. They saw these snarling, three-chord anarchists as talentless primitives, spitting on the temple of high art they had so painstakingly constructed. Bruford's reaction was characteristically contrarian and insightful. He didn't particularly like the music, but he absolutely loved what it represented. He saw punk as a healthy enema, a necessary and vital purgative for a rock scene that had become decadent, self-indulgent, and hopelessly disconnected from its audience. He agreed with the punk's central critique that music had become a spectator sport, dominated by untouchable rock gods playing in soulless arenas. He understood that punk, in its own crude way, was reclaiming the immediacy and danger that he had sought in King Crimson. It was a reset button, a reminder that the spirit of rock and roll was about energy and communication, not technical perfection and 20-minute keyboard solos. His ability to see the validity in his supposed enemy's argument is perhaps the most telling evidence of his profound disillusionment with the state of the genre he helped create. His ultimate verdict on progressive rock can be found in the career he built for himself from the 1980s onwards. He systematically moved away from the rock arena, forming his own jazz ensemble, Earthworks. This was not a side project. This was the culmination of his life's musical journey. In Earthworks, he finally created a context where his core values could flourish without compromise. It was a small, agile, conversational group. The emphasis was on improvisation, on subtle interplay, on the joy of creating something new every night. He even experimented with electronic drums, not as a gimmick, but as a way to expand the sonic and melodic possibilities of his instrument, proving his progressive instincts were still sharp. He just needed a more suitable outlet for them. He had come full circle, returning to his first love, jazz, having passed through the crucible of stadium rock, and emerged with his artistic integrity, not only intact, but strengthened. So, what did Bill Bruford think of progressive rock? He saw it as a noble failure. He loved its initial ambition, its intellectual curiosity, and its refusal to accept the limitations of pop music. He was immensely proud of the technical skill it demanded and the musical doors it opened, but he despised what it became, a pompous, overproduced, and creatively stagnant beast. He loathed its fear of improvisation, its reverence for the recorded artifact over the live performance, and its descent into a predictable formula of virtuosity for virtuosity's sake. He believed the genre betrayed its own name by ceasing to progress. For Bill Bruford, the word progressive was a verb, an active principle, a way of working. For the industry and for many of his peers, it had simply become a noun, a marketing tag for a particular style of music. He wasn't a prog rock drummer. He was a restless, fiercely intelligent musician who just happened to spend a formative part of his career in some of the world's most famous prog rock bands. He didn't hate the genre. He was simply too progressive for it. And that is the beautiful, uncompromising truth he would probably be quite happy for you to know.